Good evening and welcome. This is the May 11th, 2022 public hearing of the Land Use Commission. The City Code directs this body to hear applications for map and text amendments, special uses including planned developments, zoning relief, and appeals from decisions of the zoning administrator, as well as to make recommendations regarding the city's long-term planning goals and objectives. Depending on the type of matter, this commission will make either a final determination or send its recommendation to City Council. Ms. Jones, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Aravallo?
Here.
Commissioner Halleck? Commissioner Cullen? Commissioner Westerberg?
Here.
Commissioner Mudinchev?
Here.
Commissioner Johnson? Commissioner Linwall?
Here.
Commissioner Hugo?
Here.
Commissioner Puctel?
Here.
And Chair Rogers.
Here. With 7 members present, we do have a quorum, and we will move on with the rest of our items here. Also present from city staff tonight are Neighborhood and Land Use Planner Megan Jones, Assistant City Attorney Brian George, Zoning Administrator Melissa Klotz, and Community Development Director Johanna Neiden. This is a formal hearing and there are rules that govern our proceedings. Most importantly, only one person speaks at a time, so all testimony may be accurately recorded. Anyone who wishes to address the commission regarding any matter on tonight's agenda will have the opportunity to do so at the appropriate time. If there are a large number of persons signed up to comment, our rules grant the chair the right to limit the amount of time for each person to speak. Commissioners may ask questions at any time. Our procedure is to hear from staff on the documents on file and then receive testimony and other evidence from the applicant or appellant. After that, persons wishing to make a statement regarding the matter will have the chance to do so. Any person with a legal interest in property located within defined notification requirements of the subject property may present evidence, reasonably question witnesses, or seek a continuance of the hearing. When all supporting and opposing testimony and statements have been heard, the applicant or appellant will be given the opportunity for rebuttal or a closing statement. Then the commission will close the record and begin deliberations to consider the standards. The commission will make formal findings of fact based on the testimony and evidence presented, guided by the standards, the commissioner's knowledge of the community, and the recommendations of staff. All testimony is taken under oath. Although we do not apply the strict rules of evidence, please limit your testimony to the proposal as it relates to the standards contained in the zoning ordinance and corresponding staff memorandum. When testifying, please state your name and address for the record, and I'm asking that you please sign in on the public comment sheet, which is in the back. Still in the back, isn't it? Yes. Yes, it's in right outside the door if you haven't signed in to speak and think that you may wish to speak tonight. Our meetings are audio and visual recorded. Please make sure you are at a microphone when asking questions or making statements so that you can be properly recorded. All proceedings are subject to broadcast at a later date. Any matter not concluded at tonight's hearing will be continued to our next regularly scheduled meeting. This evening, we have one item on the agenda, which is an appeal of the zoning administrator's decision regarding 1566 Oak Avenue, case 22 ZMJV 0031. Is the appellant present? Yep. All right. And staff obviously is present as well. At this point, I'm going to give just a brief moment for anybody who has not signed up, who thinks that they may wish to speak, to go to the back and sign up. And then I'm going to ask Ms. Klotz if she could please bring that up to me, the sign-in sheet. If you signed up online, we have a list of that. This is for people who have not signed up online. While we're waiting for that, I'm going to ask anybody who may be speaking to us tonight to please be sworn in at this time. If you'd raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth throughout the course of these proceedings? Yeah. Thank you. I'll have to wait for her to get back. Actually, we'll go ahead and approve the minutes for our meeting. We have the minutes for our April 13th meeting. Has everyone had an opportunity to look through those? And are there any edits, changes that need to be made?
I actually have a couple of edits that I caught rereading through them regarding the vote on the adjournment of the meeting and then an erroneous vote that was added after the vote for billboards. So I'll make those changes, but if there are any additional ones, we can hear those as well.
None? Is there a motion to approve the minutes for April 13th, 2022?
I'll move to approve the minutes.
Moved by Westerberg. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Putel. Would you please call the roll? We don't need to call the roll anymore since we're in person again. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, I'm guessing that's a 7-0 vote, and so the
I'm
minutes are
abstaining, Mr.
approved
Chairman.
with the edits that have been,
I was not at the last.
Oh, I'm
meeting,
sorry.
I'm abstaining.
sorry, so it'll be a
Yeah,
6.
same.
It'll be
I
a
was also not here.
5-0 and 2 vote. So with that now, we will move on to the new business, which is the appeal. Ms. Klotz, would you please read that into the record for us?
1566 Oak Avenue, 22 ZMJV 0031. Chris Dillo, appellant, appeals the decision of the determination of use issued by the zoning administrator on March 17th, 2022, regarding operations of Connections for the Homeless at the Margarita Inn at 1566 Oak Avenue, which found the operations to be consistent with the zoning ordinance definition for rooming house, section 618.3, and also found existing special use ordinance 51-0-74, adopted in 1974, is no longer valid. The Land Use Commission is the determining body for this case in accordance with section 6398 of the Evanston Zoning Code and ordinance 92-021. On April 30th, 2022, the application was revised to include co-appellant John Cleve, and some additional public comments were emailed out to commissioners prior to the meeting. And just to note that there is a public comment in the packet that is a request for a continuance.
Thank you. In regard to the continuance, our standard operating procedure has been to take testimony of the people who have come out to speak tonight and make a determination on the validity of a continuance after that testimony. So for those people who have taken the time to come out, we aren't asking you to come back to make testimony at a different date. Do you have the list of people who signed up to speak electronically? So while you're getting that, at this point, Mr. Dillo and, I'm sorry, I've forgotten. Mr. Cleve, if you would like to sort of present your case to us, and please step up to the lectern and state your name and address for the record.
I'm John Cleve. I live at 1109 Grove Street in Evanston. And I do appreciate you all giving me a chance to speak. We had some slides. Is there a clicker with slides we sent today? Yeah, that's it. All right. Trying to think how to do that. So, and I'm obviously not a lawyer, but I will try to be succinct and whatnot. All right, so let's see here. How do you do the next one? It's that one. So what I'm seeking from the Land Use Commission is to overturn that first part of what Melissa had talked about, namely that the finding that the operations of Connections for the Homeless is consistent with, at the Margarita Inn, is consistent with the zoning ordinance definition for rooming house. So it's really the question of whether that is the appropriate designation here. I'll try to be brief in this. I'm really boiling it down to two arguments. First one being is that that designation has been inaccurate and will in the future be inaccurate, and that the intended use in practice is closer to other special uses that might be defined in 618.3. There's a other piece of it, which is a sub-argument that it does violate several of the, by calling it a rooming house, you violate a couple of the principles in 63510, standards for special use. So going to the first one. Yeah, for 2 years, both the city and Connections has been calling the Margarita Inn a homeless shelter. In an 11, and this is all in the packet, in the appeal that we had put in. In 11/9/20 memo from city staff to city council members, the staff recommended approval of $80K in CDBG CV funding for Connections for the Homeless for, quote, homeless shelter operations. The city allocated money for Connections under the CARES Act for the needs of homeless and unstably housed families. The city proposed the partnership with Connections for short and long-term homeless needs. Minutes from the Housing and Community Development Act Committee meeting on Tuesday, May 18, 2021, included reference to the Margarita Inn as a 24/7 homeless shelter for up to 80 people. Connections on its website, though it has been brought down, has stated that Hilda's Place has grown to provide shelter to the homeless 365 days a year, now with the Margarita Inn. In interviews with the media outlets, Connection staff has repeatedly referred to the Margarita Inn as a shelter for the homeless. According to the Illinois Department of Human Services, a person is considered homeless if they lack a regular and adequate nighttime residence. A person whose residence is a public or privately operated temporary shelter is considered homeless. And it defines a transitional shelter as providing shelter, food, and supportive services for up to 24 months. That, I believe, homeless shelter, transitive shelter, is an accurate description of the current and as well as intended operation of the Margarita Inn. In addition, I would argue that there are several other definitions in 618.3 that might also equally apply to what the Connections have stated intent of how to run the Margarita Inn in their original request for determination from Melissa. And namely, those second two that are shown up there, transitional treatment facility or assisted living facility. 618.3 defines a transitive treatment facility as a facility licensed by the state of Illinois that provides supervision, counseling, and therapy through a temporary living arrangement for individuals recovering from addiction to alcohol or narcotic drugs in order to facilitate their transition to independent living. And if you look at an April 19th Evanston Roundtable article, Betty Bogg told the House and Homeless Commission that we have substantive use disorder support, employment counseling, and many additional supportive services. And she said that the facility offers rich case management led by licensed staff, trained residential workers, and partnerships with community providers, on-site licensed nursing staff to provide physical and mental health care, and on-site mental health professionals providing individual and group therapy. To me, that it would fall within the definition of the transitional treatment facility. Assisted living is potentially another argument to make, in that ultimately the definition is a facility for adults in need of some protective oversight or assistance due to functional limitations that provides a living arrangement integrating shelter, food, and other supported services to maintain a resident's functional status. Those facilities that include personal care, such as assistance with activities of daily living, shall be licensed as shelter care facilities pursuant to provision of the Evanston City Code. And I would argue that a 2015 study, which we included a link in there, 45% of the homeless in the United States suffer from mental illness and 25% from serious mental illness. Presumably then, many of the residents at the Margarita Inn will suffer from mental illness and therefore require protective oversight or assistance due to functional limitations that is caused by it. Connections provide psychological care, substance abuse care, counseling, and other services associated with an assisted living facility, as well as supportive services such as providing bedded and meals, unlike operators of rooming houses. So my last point, my last point here is that if you look in Evanston, there are 46, as of a 2018 report to the council, there are 76 buildings registered as rooming houses. The vast majority of them are buildings that are owned by Northwestern that operate as student housing. It's really not anything like any of the rooming houses that we currently have in the city. It's a special thing. It's a thing that provides rooming house as well as all of these wraparound services. Therefore, the argument is simply to say it's a rooming house is an inaccurate description of the intent that Connections has with there. The other point to be had is that the definition of a rooming house says it excludes food service, and Connections is indirectly brought in food via the religious, several of the interfaith churches that have come in there. So that's my first point. The second point is a lesser one, that if you look through the standards for special use, concerning this, that it's ultimately, if calling it a rooming house, we're going to violate four of them, according to our interpretation of it. First one is that it's one of the special uses specifically listed in the zoning ordinance. And like I said, an argument can be made that it's an assisted living or that it's a transitive treatment facility. The second one is that it will not cause, number B is, it will not cause a negative cumulative effect when its effect is considered in conjunction with the cumulative effect of various special uses of all types on the immediate neighborhood and the effect of the proposed type of special use on the city as a whole. And I'll quote the Fourth Ward councilperson's own words from October 2020, who admitted that a lot of the services that Evanston offers are all here in the Fourth Ward, not exclusively, but disproportionately. So we're seeing the impact here that other neighborhoods in Evanston as a whole aren't necessarily feeling. So, by allowing the Connections to operate this as a rooming house for the 50 or 60 odd people that they'll have in it, you're piling on. It's creating a cumulative effect of adding it to the YMCA, to the YWCA, to the shelter, the meal services provided by St. Mark's and St. Paul's, the methadone clinic on Davis. There's an awful lot of things within, that are serving the similar population of needs, all within a 3 or 4 block radius of the residents that live around the Margarita Inn. So the third one is another one, which is it doesn't interfere with or diminish the value of property in the neighborhood. And as our appeal went in, there are several studies that have shown it very well can cause a reduction in property value. Ultimately, as I said, I won't cite them, but they are listed with links in the appeal that we gave it. I also mentioned that if we do set it up as a rooming house, the city loses virtually all control over it other than them fulfilling the needs of a rooming house. A bathroom for every 6 people, and they change the sheets once a week. So this is going to be a thing where ultimately we're going to set this, and very little can be done leverage-wise by the city should it not live up to it. Maybe it's a model of a place, but there's the risk that it's not a model. And at which case then it's a rooming house as long as they don't have too many nuisance complaints, bada bim, bada boom, the city's powerless. The other piece I'll bring up is the 260 police and fire EMT calls to 5066 Oak, which came from a FOIA request to the Evanston Police and Fire EMT. It's an average of 3 a week, and I would argue that having a police or fire vehicle on Oak Street out there is going to diminish the property values of not only the houses that are around there, but the businesses up and down Davis, the businesses over on Maple Street. Northlight Theater is going in there. The King Home will soon have 500 elderly folk who are going to have, dementia and Alzheimer's. It can't help but potentially diminish the desirability and therefore value of the King Home and the 1020 Oak, which is another facility targeted at 55-plus-year-olds across the street on Grove Street. So the final one here is that D is it's adequately served by public facilities. Again, the argument that we give is 260 police and fire calls over 2 years, 3 a week. This police force is down by 25 people. We've spoken to Chief Eddington. And both Chief Eddington and Officer Mike Jones have been to some of the community meetings that we've had around it. They're not big fans. They're 25 people short. They're having to put people out there to deal with the various investigations and things that have happened at Connections, and more than just drive-bys or sit-down. They were 3 death investigations. There were 2 sexual assault investigations, 8 thefts. There was several batteries. There was an arson. These are serious things that police then have to spend time on gathering evidence, going in, communicating with people. It's a drain. It's a drain on services, and we've yet to see anything from either the city or Connections that has done any kind of longitudinal study that says, look, this is how we are not going to have it be a potential drain. So therefore, a standard D, in our opinion, hasn't been met. So my final summary, just to come up, is it hasn't been run as a rooming house. It's a hybrid model at best. It seems to combine multiple things there. If indeed the commission upholds the idea of it being a rooming house, they will be held to the laxest possible standards of operation with a high need community living there. Ultimately, it's going to open the door to other applications of people who could very well jump in other parts of the city and use the same light definition of rooming house to do it. Therefore, I'm urging you all to reject the idea that it's a rooming house. Let's call it a special case. Let's let Connections and the city work together to define this thing in a way that provides protections both for the neighbors that are around it and for the residents that are living in Margarita Inn. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Mr. Cleve. Are there questions for Mr. Cleve from commissioners at this time? I'm sorry. I'm just going to tell the commissioners I can't see lights. So if you're using a light, I cannot see it because it's hidden behind my computer. So just raise your hand, wave, just start speaking when there's silence.
Specifically, which use do you think should be assigned?
Well, and that is the conundrum, because I think it should be a transitive shelter. But the problem with the transitive shelter is it specifically says it's a very temporary stay. And so what they're saying, it's a rooming house because it has guests, it's 30 days plus on the stay, and so therefore it's a conundrum in that it doesn't really line up with any of those things. The fact that not only is it a transitive shelter, but one that's providing extensive social services, it kind of puts it over into the transitive treatment facility. So I don't know. I mean, I've read over the code again and again and again. And it's like there's nothing in there. I mean, they're doing a unique model, just like Right In out in Oak Park is a unique model. Rockford's got one. Bellevue, Washington has one. There's one down in Florida. But in all of these cases, the organization and the city came together to define what this thing is and to make sure that all interests are there, and ultimately then move forward with a shared model of a thing. And that's exactly what Connections hasn't done, which is to say, let's forge this together in a series of meetings between the neighborhood, the police, the city staff, and Connections, and let's craft this thing together. Let's not kind of slide under and say, oh, it was a rooming house, and now it is a rooming house, and so therefore we want to avoid all due process. That feels to a lot of the neighbors and around that it was an underhanded move to try to circumvent the discussion that we should have.
Other questions from commissioners? If not, at this point, I'm going to ask Ms. Klotz, since she was the zoning administrator who made the decision, if she would like to give us any insight into her thoughts and decision-making process for rendering this decision.
Thank you, Chair Rogers. To respond to the appellant's last points and what my thought process was in making the determination, I felt that it was not a transitional shelter, primarily due to the length of stay. The zoning ordinance does define transient guests, and given that the guests at the Margarita Inn are staying for an average of 9 or 10 months or more, I felt that that is not considered transient, and therefore is not considered a transitional shelter. The other...
Yeah, transit treatment. That's another one.
For a transitional treatment facility, the zoning ordinance definition for that specifically states that it is for drug rehabilitation, so I felt that it did not meet that definition either.
Assisted living was the other one that was.
Assisted living, I did not do a deep dive into. I do not believe it meets that definition. Assisted living facilities are licensed by the state under assisted living licensing, and zoning follows that same use interpretation for that.
Are there questions for Ms. Klotz from commissioners?
Just a question. Does the extent of services offered by Connections to the residents there, doesn't that take the term rooming house about as far as you can really push it? I understand you're kind of bound by the definitions in the code. I get it, but it does seem as if that's a little off the mark.
I did consider it, and ultimately, the definition does not say that services cannot be offered, and I'm thinking of other facilities throughout the city that also offer services. Thinking of, for instance, the YMCA, that is a rooming house. Services are offered there. There are other rooming houses. There's even just typical general residential, multifamily residential that also offers some supportive services. Zoning does not, since the zoning definitions specifically do not prohibit that, zoning does not consider some services offered to be the cutoff point.
Does zoning address the issue of licensing at all for any of these supportive housing groups in terms of what they do have to go through with the city due process and looking at their criteria for being able to manage the population?
certain uses, yes, because some, if they're licensed by the state, and then some, if the city itself has specific licensing through the health department, which rooming houses are licensed through there.
Melissa, I'm interested in knowing other examples of when rooming house and transitional shelter have been used, either past or present, in Evanston. I know you mentioned the YMCA. Can you, off the top of your head, can you think of any other examples of those particular terms so we can help give the most amount of context to this situation?
Other rooming houses in the city, the new domestic violence shelter at the YWCA, the units within there are rooming house units. Overall, the zoning use is a domestic violence shelter because that's another specific use within the zoning ordinance, but the units are rooming house units, and there are supportive services offered there as well. I know there are a variety of smaller multifamily buildings that different nonprofit groups throughout the city run. Most of those are generally seen as under the radar because they are just considered residential. There's Boys Hope and Girls Hope, which are in large single-family homes that have obtained special uses for rooming houses where there's probably 15 or so teenage students who live in the house and function as a household, and they have fairly substantial supportive services to ensure that they are successful with their high school and on through their college career. And they live there during the school year.
Any examples of the transitional shelter?
I believe that regulation was established after Hilda's place got off the ground. So I can't say for certain, but I don't think zoning has had specifically that use come forward.
With Boys Hope and Girls Hope, isn't there a specific, like a child care facility? Isn't there a specific zoning definition that addresses those? Like a group home is what I'm thinking of.
Yes, I'm trying to remember offhand.
I think there's one, it's 4 to 8, and then one.
I think they're
in the
residential
8
care
I think
homes type 2, I believe.
I think so.
But
But but the point is, they have a separate definition.
They do, yes. Child residential care homes.
Other questions?
There's also a variety of rooming houses that are the larger facilities that I'm thinking of, for instance, the Lucky Platter building. Those are all rooming house units, and there's a variety of others over in that area of the city as well. I don't think most of those buildings have supportive services.
Melissa, generally speaking, what oversight does the city have over rooming houses in terms of activities? Obviously, over buildings, you have a building review.
A special use is required, so conditions can be added for as much oversight as we want.
But there's no one standard at this point, is that correct?
No.
Okay.
Any other questions from commissioners at this point? Who's our online speaker? Okay. So I have a list of 7 people who have signed up to speak. has everyone had an opportunity? Because I don't want to play the game where after we're done, everybody gets up and says, oh, I want to add something in. So get your name in now. So I'll go ahead and start calling off the list. I'm not going to place time limits on anyone that's speaking tonight, since we do have not that many people who have volunteered to speak on the case. I will ask for people to try to keep their conversation and their comments directed toward the appeal that's before us. I understand there are some property standards issues that some people want to speak about, things like that, but I'm going to ask those not be brought up because that's not what we're here to discuss this evening. Just so everyone knows, there is a second appeal pending on this particular property from the owner of the Margarita Inn. And so what happens here tonight is not the end-all and be-all. There will be at least one other hearing. There will probably be at least two other hearings on this particular matter. So reserve your conversation, or reserve your comments for the appropriate time, which will be if there's a special use application submitted, that's when we'll want to hear that type of testimony. So at this point, I will ask, the first name I have is Chris Dillow. If you would like to come up and just state your name and address for the record.
Hold on. Technical malfunction here. Hi, thank you. My name is Chris Dillow. I'm a resident of the 4th Ward. I appreciate taking the time as an appellant we wanted to make sure that we didn't break any rules, so we made sure that John Cleve spoke and did so obviously eloquently. One thing that I wanted to bring up and to clarify is the YMCA. I wasn't intending on doing that, but I think it's super important, right? The guests of the YMCA, they pay rent. They are men. They are vetted. They have rules in place. There are rules around controlled substances and alcohol. They don't require the same services, if any, and I don't know their operational model, but I don't believe that there are services that are applied there. When you look at historically the folks in the neighborhood, there is no persistent criminality. There's no police calls. There are some, of course, right? But no more than any of the other neighborhoods. It doesn't come anywhere near the amount of services required, the amount of burden placed on the police and fire that the Margarita Inn has in just 2 years. So the idea that those are compatible, that those are a comp to each other is absolutely not the case. We have done so much research to understand where the rooming houses are in the city, and Margarita Inn doesn't come anywhere near any of those things. So that's one thing. What I did come up here to say was that in March of 2020, the city of Evanston, based on an Illinois emergency COVID rules, authorized Connections for the Homeless to run a homeless shelter. And as John mentioned, so many documentations, so much money, so many designations were clear that this was a homeless shelter. Okay, so there's no arguing that. We started out as an emergency homeless shelter. Now, that emergency order actually ended in May 2020. Now, under what designation or order we've been operating in under that, I brought that to this forum earlier. I still don't know the answer to that. But since then, since that has happened, Connections for the Homeless has created a homeless shelter, and I'll call it an experiment, that defies any sort of national practices, that disregards the city's shelter regulations. I mean, that is what it was supposed to be, right, is a homeless shelter, and that's what the city said. There is no vetting. The proximity to schools, it's within 500 feet of schools. It goes against the occupancy limits of any of our special uses. It's even ignored the memorandum of understanding between the city, because the city said, hey, you can't have any controlled substances or alcohol, and they say clearly right in their guidance and when they sign up that yes, you can have alcohol in your rooms. So clearly they are not looking at this as what they were intended to be at the beginning. Right now, they are concentrating a large number of individuals and this is what I mean about best practices, they're concentrating a large number of individuals, not just men like the YMCA, but families, young men and women, folks that are suffering from mental illness, folks that are suffering from drug addiction, as well as homeless folks that are looking for help and homeless folks that just need a place to stay. So there is no criteria, there is no parameters as to who is going to stay there, right? Yeah, some folks stay for quite a while. It's still within the parameters of Illinois Health, what they say is a transitional home, but there's a lot of folks that come, go, some stay, some leave a lot earlier. The results of this experiment has been over 260 calls to the police and fire. And if that number doesn't match up with what they've seen in the building, I'm going to go with FOIA. I'm going to believe the city of Evanston. I'm going to believe the fire department. I think that's probably solid foundation for that. That's 5 times the number per resident at Albany Care. Albany Care, which our alderman said is a nightmare. Albany Care, where we are literally trying to pull their license. 5 times the number of police and fire calls per resident as Albany Care. So I'll just stop saying that over and over again, but I mean, that's probably pretty important, all right? Now, those include deaths, drug overdoses, aggravated assault, battery. As John said, we've heard from police interim chief, the interim police chief, the community officer, Mike Jones, has all said this is an overwhelming burden on an already understaffed police force. I think what I'm getting at is that right now we have decided, we have made the interpretation that this is a rooming house. And I am asking this group to say, you know what? Changing the sheets once a week is not sufficient regulatory obligations for what we have created here. What I'm here and what I'm asking for is to say, look, this is a homeless shelter, you know? That is what it is. That's the people that live there. That's the people that they take in from Cook County, from Evanston. 40% of these folks don't even live in Evanston or didn't come from Evanston, right? So what we're saying is, look, I'm not telling you that that shouldn't be there, but the city of Evanston said this is a homeless shelter. So if anything, I am asking this group to say, let's make an interpretation that the city of Evanston was correct, that it is a homeless shelter, and if they want to be something else, they can ask for a variance. They can ask for an amendment. They can say, look, yes, we are a transitional shelter, but we have these great ideas. We want to do these other things. Sure, come work with the city, work with the residents, do your variance, and see if you can get that approved. But let's not just sit here today and say, well, we don't have a designation, so by default, let's call it a rooming house, because that is not going to end well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dillo. The second name I have on the list is Eric Passett.
My name is Eric Passett, and I'm also the owner of North Shore Apartments and Condos. So I wouldn't say I'm a landlord. I'm going to say I'm an apartment rental agency in the immediate neighborhood. Along with, I am also a resident of the Fourth Ward. I literally live on Oak, about a block and a half away. So I've been involved in real estate, or at least the rental part of the real estate, for about 35 years. So I'm older than I look. But I guess you know, the part I'm gonna say is how it adversely affects the neighborhood. That's the part I'm going to concentrate on. As far as I'd say a lot of people know that the Cook County assessor shifted the burden of taxes from residents onto landlords. So that means a lot of people's taxes went down, you know, being residents, people own houses. Landlords went up from anywhere from 40 to 80%, their taxes went up. That is documented, and it's clear evidence. So we are forced to raise our rents, and I can tell you, since now, you know, you can't say it's all because of Marguerite Inn, okay? There's been a lot of things that's happened the last couple of years, okay? But what I can tell you is there's been some residents in our buildings in that neighborhood that won't renew their lease, that they're moving out, and they specifically said because of the Marguerite Inn being next door and the problems it's caused them. It's also caused us to lower our rents Because if you can't attract people at the rent, you need to attract them at, eventually you got to find some kind of bottom, so you can attract people. And we've been forced to lower our rents while our expenses have not gone down. They've actually gone way up. So let me ask you a question, and I'm not asking you to think, but if you owned a building very close by, you probably would feel, as we feel, to say we're appalled would be probably an understatement. If we wouldn't be here, people wouldn't be here appealing this if they had been good neighbors. Okay? We're not appealing. I know there's a couple, I wouldn't say homeless shelters, but there's a couple places similar to this in the neighborhood. Okay? You know, you could say the Cambridge House. I don't know exactly what they do, but I know I wouldn't say it's similar, but it's, you know, let's say they house people that don't always have a place to live. Okay? Well, we can probably establish that. I've taken care of some buildings in that neighborhood, which is like Judson and Dempster. I don't see the problems like we're seeing here. People are talking about the YWCA, different group of people, citizens. We don't have problems there. We have the YMCA. We're definitely not having problems there. And as people have stated, we're having how many people? I can tell you that last year during the warm weather, tons of congregation of people outside of the building, and people cigarette, smoking, which, okay, whatever, harassing tenants from other buildings, not just asking them for money, almost demanding, and you would think at this point, being 2 years into this, a lot of the problems would have been worked out. As we can clearly state, there's been, if you look at the police blog, they haven't been. As a resident, the neighborhood's changed. Now, you can't say it's all because of one part of it, but it's definitely been a large contribution because of it. So like I said, I don't think we would be here if there weren't problems that have not been addressed. And you think after 2 years they would have been addressed. So enough said.
Thank you. Next speaker is Tina Payton.
Good evening. My name is Tina Payton. I live at 1122 Emerson, and I would like to speak on the appeal, and I hope after our comments tonight that you will reverse your decision to call the Margarita a rooming house. Just will say two places, since we're talking about the YMCA and the Margarita, and the difference between rooming house and transitional shelter. This is from the presentation from the Connections from the Homeless gave at the church, and they gave the definition of transitional shelter, which is a building or portion thereof in which sleeping accommodations are provided on an emergency basis for the temporarily homeless. The definition for a rooming house, a building or portion thereof containing lodging rooms that accommodate more than 3 persons who are not members of the keeper's family, and where lodging, excluding food service, is provided for compensation, whether direct or indirect. The YMCA is a rooming house for 172 rooms, and they charge rent. The Margarita does not charge rent. It's a transitional shelter which was established in 2020 during our COVID emergency. Number 2, it says, as I said, excluding food service. From what I know, the YMCA does not include food service. From Connections of the Homeless pamphlet, says they provide their people 3 meals a day for no compensation. Sarah Flax, the city official here, had a meeting at the Housing and Homelessness Commission, and someone asked, how long do the people stay at the YMCA? And she says, well, we've had people up to 20 years living at the YMCA because it's permanent homes. Connections for the Homeless, in their brochures that they passed out, they said the average length of stay is currently 289 days, or approximately 10 months. Participants can stay as long as they need in order to secure stable housing. That would indicate that they're not permanent housing if they're only staying there for a short time to move to permanent housing. Also, it says in the Connections information, Connections, along with other shelter providers. In that line alone, it just admitted that they were a shelter provider, is listed as resource for returning citizens who may experience homelessness. Also, it says the Margarita Inn does not shelter people with a history of violence or child sexual crimes. Also, in their brochure that they passed out at the church, where do people go when they leave the Margarita Inn? The answer, most people exit the Margarita Inn to stable housing. That means they're an emergency transitional shelter from homeless to see if they can go into stable housing. Other destinations could be a different shelter. This is in Connections pamphlet. A different shelter, admitting they're a shelter. Returning to family, a hotel or resident that pays for sometimes, or sadly return to homeless. Also, they say, although the Margarita Inn is triple the size of our former shelter at Hilda's Place, it cannot serve all those in need. So many times in their own brochure, they talk about being a shelter, a transitional shelter from homeless, stay at the Margarita, and find stable housing. Some of you may think that people here testifying are being biased or don't want homeless shelters in the neighborhood. We're not asking that. We're asking you to do the right thing and call what it is a transitional shelter. And then you need to follow the law as of transitional shelter. Because you say here in the code that 30 occupants maximum. And they said they shelter much more than that, 46 rooms. So they'd have to cut the amount of people in the shelter, and an annual city license is required. So you should put them as a shelter and make them apply for a license as a transitional shelter and review their actions over the years. There's been many calls to the Margaritas that is not good for the city. I was at another ward meeting, 4th Ward meeting, and Officer Mike Jones said they are regularly called to the Margarita for death investigation. This is serious, folks. You may want to say you're approving to do the right thing, then you need to do the right thing right here. I'm also going to speak because I'm a landlord here. Some of
Ms.
you
Payton,
may.
I'm going to ask you to kind of wrap up.
Well, I will, but you said there was no limit, so
I know, but you're going on about 8 minutes, and so.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead, but I'm just going by what you said earlier.
And now I'm asking you to please
Okay.
wrap it up.
So I'm a landlord here in Evanston, and I have worked with Connections for the Homeless for many years. And I have taken people from the shelter, and I'm not sure what you call family promise, but they are house homeless people as well. And it's not that many families. And I think they need to come back, change it to a homeless shelter, and come back, notify the residents, and be able to work together with the city and the residents as a transitional homeless shelter. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker up, and I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of difficulty reading the handwriting. Is it maybe Jim or Jen Sawani? Forgive me for not.
My name is Jenny Savari. I live at 1241 Maple in the 4th Ward. I have been a donor and volunteer at Connections since 2013. It is a well-run, professional organization. I have personally seen their experienced, highly trained, dedicated staff in action at the Margarita Inn, Hilda's Place, and the Dewey Drop-In Center. I know firsthand that they are doing their work well and effectively. Last year, on October 3rd, I attended a 4th Ward meeting about my fellow neighbors' grievances with Connections operation at the Margarita Inn. Since October, I have purposely and consistently walked, run, driven my car, and ridden my bike by the Margarita Inn at all hours to see for myself the situation. I have not seen or experienced rampant, terrifying criminal behavior, not once. The pandemic has increased poverty and homelessness in our community. Connections isn't serving as a magnet for people looking for services. If that were the case, Evanston would be overwhelmed by homeless people sleeping in tents. My husband and I purposefully moved back to Evanston after graduating from Northwestern to raise our 3 children here. A diverse, equitable, and an inclusive environment. I hope the city will walk the walk and make us proud to be Evanstonians.
Thank you, Ms. Savari. Again, I'm going to butcher this name, I know. It looks like maybe Nia Tavolirian?
That's very well done. It took me a long time to figure it out, too. Nia Tavalaris.
Tavalaris, okay.
Yes. Hi. Thank you, Chairman Rogers. Thank you for trying to pronounce my name. Thank you, members of the commission. My name is Nia Tavalaris. I'm the Director of Development, actually, at Connections for the Homeless. And I'm really proud to be part of the leadership team at Connections. We have about 90 outstanding employees. We have thousands of donors and supporters. We have 1,600 volunteers who work with us every single year. And we deliver essential services to people facing homelessness in our community and those who are housing insecure. There have been a lot of concerns expressed this evening and from citizens and neighbors, and I won't be responding specifically to those concerns, as it is that our matters technically, and I know this is very lawyery, this is what the lawyers tell me, our matter technically is not actually before you guys this evening, but when it is, we will be responding in full to all of the concerns that you have heard this evening. But what I do want to do is I just want to share just a quick overview for your just information about what it is our work is and what we've been doing at the Margarita at a high level. Last year, we served 4,000 people, not all at the Margarita, but we served 4,000 people through our primary program pillars. Eviction prevention, which keeps people out of homelessness to start with. Drop-in services and bridge housing for individuals and families in crisis, and long-term support for households to remain housed once they find stable housing. People seek our help when they have a sudden change brought on by financial crisis due to job loss, by medical emergency, perhaps from growing up in generational poverty as a result of systemic oppression. And in the past 2 years, Connections has housed more than 300 people experiencing homelessness, more than around 50 of them children, because of these crises that I mentioned. We house them at local hotels, 3 at one point, including the Margarita Inn. As the leading agency in the northern suburbs delivering these essential services, we are also the leading experts in developing the programming needed to end homelessness. That is actually what our mission is. One key component of that programming is bridge housing, which provides a stable place for people who've lost their home to stay while they get back on their feet and ultimately find a permanent housing solution. The program that we are operating at the Margarita Inn is one of such several new programs that have evolved in rooming houses or hotel-like facilities in Cook County and around the country since the pandemic began. This new innovative model at the Margarita Inn provides 24-hour housing in the form of private, semi-private rooms in a secure facility. In addition to Connections delivering rich wraparound services, which you've heard a lot about, we employ professionally licensed staff, we have trained residential workers, and we partner with other community providers like the YMCA, the YWCA, Trilogy, Peer Services, etc. In addition to intensive case management, which you've also heard a lot about, our services include on-site physical and mental health care via licensed nursing staff, mental health professionals who provide individuals group therapy, none of which is paid for by anyone living at the Margarita. None of it is required. This is all optional services for people when they're in the process of rebuilding their lives. Homelessness in Evanston is a community crisis. The waiting list for housing services at the Margarita Inn is currently more than 50 individuals, and it grows every day. Every day, our staff picks up the phone and hears another family in crisis and tells them, we don't have room for you tonight. Come into our drop-in location, start speaking with a case manager. We can get you some canned food. We can get you a change of clothes. We'll get you on the waiting list. That's what our team does every single day. People ask why we need to be operating at the Margarita Inn. Why can't we go someplace else? Our primary reason is that the Margarita Inn is where it is. And there is no similar facility in the area that we have been able to find and identify. It provides individual rooms with private bathrooms. It has enough space for staff. It's incredibly functional, with the exception of the 100-year-old elevator. That's a little tricky. That is why other homeless providers, though, are also using hotels and rooming houses to create this innovative form of shelter throughout Cook County, the state of Illinois, and around the country. Second, the location of the Marguerite Inn is excellent. It is in a great neighborhood. It is close to transportation. It is close to other social service agencies and places of business where people can buy coffee and lunch and step outside and enjoy a great neighborhood. Our residents deserve to benefit from the assets just as well as any other Evanston resident. And in fact, people in need already frequent the area because it has so many advantages. It is simply not true that the Margarita attracts people experiencing homelessness into Evanston. 86% of the people we serve, 86% of the people we have served in the Margarita since we started operating it are Evanston people. We are not bringing in people from other communities. They are Evanstonians who we are helping to serve. Rather than being a drain on the community resources, we have actually brought resources into the community and we serve its residents. Finally, and I will be wrapping up, we've been operating and evolving for 2 years at the Margarita Inn. We have had enormous success both keeping people safe and helping them transition to permanent housing. At the same time, we've been refining this new model of bridge housing. We've been modifying our policies and our procedures. We've been adding and enhancing services and adding staff. The furor over our presence arose late into that 2-year period, as it appears most people didn't even realize that we were there. Now, the concerns of some neighbors have caused us to examine our staffing, policies, and procedures anew, and we are always open to new solutions. But we are finding that this model, it is an excellent model. More than 66% of the people who leave the Margarita end up stably housed. With 37 years of experience in providing services to this population in this community, we recognize the value of this new format, and it is providing an enormous value to our community as a whole. Thank you very much.
Ms. Tavaleros, before you sit down, I have a couple questions
Sure.
for you.
I will do my best.
So let's say I am a homeless individual or a housing challenged person.
A person experiencing homelessness?
Whatever the correct, I'm sorry, I don't know.
No,
the
that's
correct
okay.
term.
Yeah.
So I reach out to you.
Uh-huh.
What is the process for intake for me to become a resident of the Margarita Inn?
Sure. So, have I ever seen you before? Have you ever been to drop-in services? You're calling on the phone?
I'm a random person. You don't know who I am.
We've never met you.
Never met me.
You walk in one day to our offices in the 5th Ward and you say, I've been sleeping in my car for 5 days. I lost my apartment. I've got all my stuff and my dog in my car. Can you guys help me out? Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. So what ends up happening is first we sit you down and we ask you, would you like to take a shower? Do you need some food? Do you need to use the phone? Just basically reconnect you to the world because we don't know where that's been, where you've been.
Excuse me just a second.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you. Little microphone difficulty, I'm sorry.
Oh, sure. Do you want to repeat your question? Okay.
Go ahead.
Sure. So what we first do is we sit down with you and we take care of whatever your immediate needs are. Because if you've been sleeping in your car for 5 days, you're probably not in a great space. What we then do is that we have you sit down with one of our case managers, and usually it's our street and community outreach case managers that are on site. So our street outreach, they're sometimes located in our 2 facilities. Now remember, that means, because you've come to drop in, that you have shown up during a very specific set of hours when we have just open drop-in hours, okay? So it's not 24 hours a day, it's not 7 days a week, it's when we have staff for drop-in services. So we sit down with you and we first start by saying, what is it that you need? What can we help you with? What's going on? How did you get here today? And believe it or not, and I think this is something that is often very surprising to people who have not experienced homelessness. Some people come out right away and they say, okay, so this is what happened. My wife kicked me out of the house. I can't come back. She's called the police on me. She won't let me in. She said she was going to shoot my dog. Like, whatever. Like, there's something that has happened in your life that has made you exit your home. Some people come up right away and they say that's what needs to happen. Like, that's where they are. That's how they got here. Some people say nothing. And they're like, I just need a place to go. Can you get me a place to go? I can't sleep in my car one more day. Like, thank you for letting me have a shower. I can't sleep in my car one day. And our answer is, we don't have a place for you to go. We don't. The police, Officer Mike Jones, everyone will tell you that when they see someone sleeping in their car and sleeping on the streets in Evanston, and they come up to them and they're like, what's going on? I don't have a place to sleep. I'm sleeping here in this park and behind this building, etc. There is not a place for them to scoop them up and take them to, including the Margarita Inn. You cannot scoop people up and take them to the Margarita Inn and be like, put this person in shelter. They need shelter tonight. So what we end up doing, because you're a single guy, we start doing a big assessment with you, okay? And it's going to take several days, several weeks for us to actually do that assessment. One of the things that we will do is we'll actually first see there's a little kind of a set of services called diversion that we will do. And so diversion services are basically like, is there something we can do right now to keep you out of the homeless shelter system? Like, can we keep you out of the service system altogether? If we paid a ticket for you to go to Alabama to stay with your brother, is that going to solve this for you? Because it's better for us to do that than it is to like get you into the system. So we first talk about doing diversion with you and see if there's any options. If we let you take some food from the food pantry, is there a neighbor you can stay with? Is there an uncle you can stay with? Like, do you have any other solutions? No, I don't have any other solutions. I don't have anywhere to go. Okay. We're going to come back. We're going to be back here tomorrow. We don't have a solution for you tonight. Do you have your phone charged? Are you going to be warm enough? Is there anything you can do tonight? I want you to come back here tomorrow. And tomorrow we're going to keep doing this process and we're going to keep working with you. So I think to your question of like what happens tonight when someone is homeless, in this community, and not only in this community, in all of our communities, we could offer you, for example, a ticket to a place called Pacific Garden Mission, which is on the south side of the city. It is a kind of a very, very, very large facility, and a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness are not comfortable going there. They consider it unsafe. It's too far away. It's not where they want to be. Because, you know, it could be that you actually have to go to work tomorrow. That's another thing, right? Like something happened, you can't stay home, but you have to go to work tomorrow, and being down there doesn't help. So we would, of course, offer you, like, do you want to go stay at some place like Pacific Garden Mission? But more than likely, you're going to say no. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I just was kind of getting to what is the process for me getting in?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. You're like, yeah, because you haven't even gotten in yet.
Is it an immediate thing, or is this a thing that takes several days, several weeks?
Weeks. Now, what happens is during that assessment, sorry, I was going through that. During that assessment, what we have to do, because we're part of a coalition of service providers that are all of Cook County, because the federal government makes all of us kind of work together. So we're part of this continuum of care. That continuum of care makes definitions for who's considered vulnerable. Do you have any chronic health conditions? Do you have an active substance use disorder?
No.
Do you know, like, how's your mental health?
I'll let the other commissioners determine that.
Right? Probably good. But you think you're good. That's what most people think they're good.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. You actually are not considered a very vulnerable homeless person. You're a man, I'm assuming. You don't have any chronic health conditions. You do not have an active substance use disorder. You do not have a mental health situation going on. So your vulnerability is actually considered low. And you're like, wait, what's the vulnerability? The vulnerability that we have to test everyone on to kind of get them into the system is the vulnerability of how soon they're going to die. That's actually what we are assessing. How vulnerable are you to death? Certain things make you more vulnerable to die on the streets than other things. So those are people that we have to take special attention to when we're figuring out who can come in and out of the Margarita Inn and when they can get in. And on average, some people, because you're not very vulnerable, you're going to probably have to wait a long time to get in. But other people, because you're a mom, you're a woman, you're a gay or transgendered youth, you are someone who has diabetes that's untreated because you can't keep your insulin in the refrigerator. These are all things that increase your vulnerability, which move you. It's a dynamic list, right? It's a dynamic list as to who gets in when, and it's based on vulnerability.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay, we look forward to coming back. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker this evening I have is Linda Baum.
Hello, my name is Linda Baum. I live at 1572 Maple Avenue, so my building is on the alley that is right at it opens right into the front of the Margarita Inn, and that's part of the reason that I'm here. I don't understand if this is a rooming house where some of the problems that we're having that we can determine are the result of the Margarita Inn are coming from. Some of those problems are, I mean, before this, I didn't see people selling drugs. I do now behind the dumpster that's on the alley. And then they'll walk out toward the Margarita Inn and sniff the drugs that they've just purchased. I've seen that myself driving down the alley. I don't know why the other young woman who was up here never sees anything. Maybe it's because I walk my dog in that neighborhood 3 or 4 times a day. And I see, and the other dog walkers from my building see people defecating and urinating at least once a day. One of my housemates, or one of the people who lives in my building, has followed that individual back. Why don't these individuals go back to the Margarita Inn if it's a rooming house and they live there to go to the bathroom? Maybe it's because they're one of the 50 people who have come to the drop-in and don't have any place to go except their car, and they're hanging around for 7 days for assessment or whatever. Maybe they're the ones. I don't know who the people are who come to try to sleep in the lobby of our building. I know where they're coming from, and I know they can't seem to get in to sleep in their rooms if it's a rooming house. I don't understand everything. I just know that I don't believe that the reason there hasn't been any furor over the last 2 years is because people didn't even notice what was going on at the Margarita Inn. I think it's because there was COVID and people were understanding of the fact that during COVID we need housing for people. And I know we still need housing for people, and I really am in favor of housing for people. But I do feel like it should be regulated. It should be something that is controlled in a way that the YMCA is controlled, where the gentlemen from that facility walk up the street and say hello and don't urinate and defecate in the alley or in the green lot that's next to us. And it's just a different situation. Maybe it's the selection process, because the men at the YMCA are selected on a totally different basis. I don't know. I don't know the answers to all the questions, but I do feel like it's not a rooming house, that it is a homeless shelter, and that we ought to admit that, and we ought to go, the regulations should be filed and followed so that there can be the kind of agreement that needs to be made so that it can be done properly.
Thank you, Ms. Baum. And the last speaker I have signed up for tonight is Mike Joyce.
Mike Joyce. I'm a resident of Evanston for 14 years. I live at 1101 Grove Street, 2 houses away from the Margarita Inn. A lot of this becomes technical. As I understand, it's not considered transitional because people live there for 9 months, up to 9 months. But if you're not paying rent, why not stay someplace for 9 months? It was compared to the Domestic Violence Center and the YMCA, and I'm repeating what other people said here. In 14 years, I've never had any problem with anybody at the YMCA or Domestic Violence Center, but we've had all kinds of problems with the Margarita in the last 2 years. Being woken up at 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning by people screaming, having shouting matches. Same thing that the woman said here, selling drugs on the streets. I haven't seen the urination, but my wife's felt very uncomfortable and unsafe. And we walk our dog too in the neighborhood, and we've chosen to go different routes because for fear of what's happening at the Margarita Inn. Now, 3 visits a week is what the statistics are that we've heard from this gentleman over here. It probably should be more than that. We've never reported any problems to the police, but I too feel for the homeless. What are the people in charge doing to counteract the problems that they've had? Why have the police or the fire department had to come so many times? And what's being done to fix that? If there was a solution, I don't think anybody here would have a problem with, but comparing it to the YMCA or the Domestic Violence Center is just total nonsense. You can't compare the two. So I've had my piece.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce. Those are the people who have signed up to speak this evening. Mr. Cleve, you have an opportunity to say anything you'd like to say kind of in summation.
Yeah, I mean.
If you could come up to the microphone, please, just so we can make sure
I
you.
won't say much. You guys have been very patient, and I think you've listened very actively. I've enjoyed your questions. I think that, ultimately we're all connected to Evanston in various ways. A lot of us are neighbors. A lot of us aren't. I would love to have it where the dialogue stops with, these guys are lying. I've walked by this place, and I've never seen a problem. I mean, the people here are not lying. We live by it. We would love to have an end to homelessness. I mean, that's a universal truth that we all want. What we don't like is that there's been a level of intimidation and bullying and denial, and I wish we could just get above that and get to a point where we can actually devise this thing in a way, that ultimately takes into account everyone's, rights and privileges, as well as the homeless people that are living there, is what I say. But I thank you all. Tough decision in the next few weeks. And like I said, this isn't a NIMBY thing, even though I've heard that term quite a bit. This is just people who want to do right, but at the same time don't want to feel unsafe. And is there a way that we can actually achieve that? I hope so. So that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Cleve.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I say one other thing as the co-appellant?
If it's brief. If it's brief.
All I want to say is everything that the folks from Connections have said, spot on. That's great. And I think everything they said was that they're a homeless shelter. I mean, I think that they proved our point time and time and time again with the services, with the folks that they attend. I think they are saying what we're saying, that this is a transitional shelter, and then we need to start there and move on.
Thank you. At this point, there is a request for a continuance that has been submitted into our packet from Mr. Scott. If you'd like to come up, please state your name and address for the record, and tell us what your continuation or your continuance is requesting.
Good evening. My name is Andrew Scott with the law offices of Dykema Gossett at 10 South Wacker Drive, Chicago, Illinois. I am here on behalf of the property owner, 1566 Oak Avenue, LLC. Mr. Chairman, the original purpose of my request for the continuance was because there were a lot of issues around the zoning administrator's use determination, and rather than hear them piecemeal, it was my opinion that in the interest of efficiency and allow the members of the Land Use Commission to hear all testimony at one time and not be thinking about some things during the course of the 2 weeks and then coming back and hearing additional testimony that it would be more efficient to handle it on May 25th. That that obviously didn't happen in terms of testimony, but we would be prepared to put on our appeal on the 25th. And I think, I don't want to speak for anyone from Connections, but I think that they would be prepared to respond to the issues that have arisen this evening on the 25th.
If I could also just briefly speak, I'm William McKenna with the law firm of Foley and Lardner representing Connections along with Donna Pugh. And, we have comments to make about the administrator's determination, sort of the legal aspects and the definitions, but I don't intend to make them tonight. If his request for an continuance is granted, we just like the privilege of assisting him with his case at the next hearing.
So, my feeling on this is that these are really two different distinct cases that are coming at this issue from two different approaches. My understanding is that your appeal, and I've not viewed your appeal because that packet has not been presented to us yet, so I'm working off information that has been provided to me. But the next appeal relates to the special use that was issued in 1974 and whether it is valid still or not. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. I will throw it to the rest of the commission, but my feeling personally is that these are two very distinct issues, and we've heard testimony on this one, which is our practice, even with a continuance, to allow people who have come out to speak so they don't have to come back. So, I mean, I'll throw it out to the rest of the commission if there is an appetite for a continuance, or if we want to resolve this case. Because I don't think the resolution of this case really applies to how you present your case when we come back in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever it is.
So I think that some of the issues that have been raised and some of the testimony that's been given by Mr. Cleve do raise the question about the validity of the special use. He's almost trying to relitigate all of the standards, which in our
right, and just so you know, I'm going to try to steer the board when we go into deliberation to keep very focused on definition of what this is. We're not here to relitigate the special use at this particular moment. My feeling is that we will probably have at least your appeal and potentially one other case beyond that relating to this subject property. So I don't know that having a continuance granted at this particular time benefits anybody, because the three cases, or at least the two cases, are very distinct and separate cases arguing different points.
Well, if we could, if the decision of the Land Use Commission is, no, let's bifurcate this in essence, and let's take the question of whether this is really a rooming house within the definition of the ordinance first, and then later, let's take the question of whether the 1974 special use is expired, then I would ask that the commission consider our legal arguments at this point as well, because we didn't sign up to be, public speakers on, the individual residents. We're here representing, in the case of Connections, the party that sought the determination.
Correct.
And I would think you would allow us to be heard on that subject. So we're happy to do it right now, or we're happy, if you continue the entire matter, to make our arguments about why it's a rooming house within the meaning of the ordinance at the next hearing when the owner presents his case, which we'll support with regard to why this special uses should still be existent.
The concern that I have with doing it in that manner is that this board can determine that it is a transitional shelter, in which case the rooming house issue is settled. So the special use that you have already on the property becomes a matter as to whether or not that special use, which was granted for a rooming house, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm looking to the city for this, whether that continues to remain valid based on the current use of the property.
Sure.
So I would prefer to settle this issue, let you make your arguments at your appeal, and then make a determination from there as to where we move forward.
So are you saying you would prefer that on behalf of Connections, we argue now why we think under the ordinance this is a rooming house, or at the next hearing?
So Connections didn't really sign up to speak tonight. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here, because we have the question first as to whether this particular decision of the zoning administrator was correct or not. And we can make the determination that it is a rooming house, it's a transitional shelter. We can make whatever determination we feel the definition of the operation fits at this particular time. The argument that you're coming then to make is going to be whether or not the validity of the special use is in effect.
Well, not exactly, because Connections has both positions. Connections believes this is properly viewed as a rooming house, and you've heard argument from the appellants, and you've heard from the zoning administrator, but Connections is really a party.
Connections is a party, and my personal preference, and I'm speaking for myself and not for the entire board, is that we would have had a special use application in our hands already so that we could be deciding this case on those merits. But that's not the case that's before us this evening. The case that's before us this evening has been brought by neighbors who say this is not a rooming house, and then we have to make that determination.
Right. And our position is it is a rooming house, and I'm happy to explain why if the commission would allow us to present our arguments.
How long do you think your arguments are?
5 or 10 minutes, the maximum.
I'm willing to let you make a brief presentation on why Connections views this as being a rooming house.
Sure. And it's really, we do support the administrator's decision, and I'll be brief. You've heard a lot of these issues, but I think you have to take them all in context, because the neighbors who have appealed in very good faith, and I don't have any issue with their good faith, they have really thrown around a term that's not in the zoning ordinance, and that's a homeless shelter. There are specific terms in the homeless shelter, in the ordinance. And the key terms, I think, are a rooming house, which is what we think this is. Well, why do we think this is a rooming house? Well, if you look at the definition, and the administrator supported this, it's a building or a portion thereof that can accommodate more than 3 persons not members of the keeper's family, and where lodging, excluding food service, is provided for compensation. Well, we've got that here. We pay per room, pursuant to a written memorandum of understanding, $75 per room per night to the owner. And we do not pay any sum to the owner. There's no bundled price to the owner for food. We do not operate food service. We do not fire up the grill. We do not, there's an old kitchen there from an old restaurant operation. It is not used, except we provide food that's donated by restaurants and by third parties to provide sustenance to some of our residents, but it is not a bundled item in which there is a single price paid for food service and lodging. And that's what this definition is talking about. This definition says, hey, you're a rooming house if you provide rooms for a price without food pricing bundled in. So we think that is the single closest definition you've got, and you're on all fours with it. A lot of talk about transitional shelter. This does not fit with transitional shelter, because first of all, that's for an emergency basis only, for the temporarily homeless, and there's a lot of additional standards there, including limitations. You can only stay in there for 12 hours a day if you're a transitional shelter. And that the occupants then have to leave during the day. So to try and fit this use into that definition just doesn't work. There was some discussion of assisted living facilities. Again, the definition in the ordinance, it doesn't work. That's a facility for adults, well, so far so good, in need of some support or assistance due to functional limitations. Hey, maybe that applies. But then it goes on to say, these are facilities that include personal care, such as assistance with the activities of daily living. And that's where you don't have a fit for assisted living, because we're not providing assistance for people getting in and out of bed. We're not providing assistance for people getting dressed, toileting, those kinds of functions. So it is not an assisted living facility. What else do you have? You've got a sheltered care home, which is defined in the ordinance, but that really doesn't fit because that has a specific requirement of 24-hour supervision and monitoring of the mental and health status of the residents who are incapable of maintaining a private or independent residence. So those we think are the relevant definitions. And we think your administrator got it right. You know, we may differ with her about whether the current special use is expired, but that's for another day, so we won't even talk about that. But we think that is the correct definition within the zoning code. And one of the commissioners asked a question about special use, and if it's determined by this board that our current special use is expired, we'll apply for another one. And at that point, it's going to be like any other special use. We're going to be subject to all the standards in the code. We're going to meet our burden of proof on all that at a public hearing. And to the extent there are either negotiated or staff requested or commission approved conditions on our operations, we'll gladly accept those and live with those because we think we can be a quality provider as a rooming house in this community. And there really is no distinction between us and the YMCA because from the perspective of the zoning ordinance language, we are both rooming houses for compensation. So that's all I have to say.
I have a question, sir.
Yes, sir.
If this group decided that a transitional shelter was the best fit of a definition, what would that mean for the operations at the Marguerite Inn?
Well, a transitional shelter has a number of different restrictions that might not be met by us. There are limitations on the maximum number of applicants. It just, you know, we are much more like a rooming house than a transitional shelter because we don't, our residents have full utilization 24 hours a day of their rooms and the common areas within the facility. Transitional shelters, you got to be out 12 hours a day. You're shifted out onto the street. We just don't fit that one at all, and our model doesn't fit that at all.
Would those be restrictions placed upon the operations?
They're actually in the zoning code for a transitional care home, but what I'm saying is we could not run the Marguerite Inn like it's being run as a rooming house where homeless people live there currently 24 hours a day for, as you've heard from some of the testimony, fairly lengthy periods of time, up to a year in some cases. If you are a transitional shelter under the ordinance, they line up and leave in the morning and they line up and come back in the evening. You're out 12 hours a day. It's just not the operation we have.
If we could go to, I think it's the next slide, it lists out the codified, there you go. That one and the next one, those are additional standards for transitional shelters, but they're ultimately additional limitations that would apply.
Are there additional questions?
If not, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So the question of a continuance has been raised. I will ask if there is an appetite for a continuance, or rather just resolving this particular portion of this matter this evening.
The continuance would be related to the special use. Is that
No, the
correct?
continuance is on the decision of the zoning administrator. That's all we're looking at this evening, is the determination that Ms. Klotz, a zoning administrator, made that this is a rooming house and whether or not that is correct.
I would recommend that we try to address that tonight if we can.
That's my preference as well. So, all right. So with that matter, we will close the record and go into deliberation and make our determination on this matter this evening. One thing I would just like us to focus on again is, as we have our discussion this evening, keep ourselves very focused on what it is we're discussing, because this is kind of a complicated issue in the fact that there are multiple issues that will be coming down the road that we will also be asked to address, but that this particular request is, this particular appeal addresses the matter as to whether or not the zoning administrator was in error when she made her decision that this is indeed a rooming house. And I'll open it up for anybody who has thoughts.
Well, I'll start. First of all, I agree that within the definitions that we have in the ordinance currently, the rooming house seems to be the best fit, but there's also a considerable amount of discussion about how the facility operates that, it says to me that this is really not a rooming house and that we need a specific definition for whatever this hybrid model is. And so, that's my concern, is that really we don't have a definition that really fits what is being, how the facility is operating. So, I guess the question becomes, do we have to pick a definition that is in the ordinance currently, or can we, side with the appellant and say to, the Connections for the Homeless that, we really need a different definition to address the broader question.
So just to speak to that, I mean, we're kind of stuck with the definitions that we do have at present, because this is a matter that's up before us at this particular time. And if we were to ask Connections for the Homeless to submit a request for a special use, they're going to have to pick something in our definitions to apply for.
Unless they apply for a text amendment to add a definition for a new facility.
Extends this out further and further.
Right, but.
And with no guaranteed outcome on that either. We can propose something, but City Council would have to adopt whatever was proposed.
Yeah, agreed. But I think that the dilemma here is that I think both sides make strong arguments. And I think that the real dilemma is that we do not have a suitable definition for this kind of facility. And while you may be able to apply, if there's a special use application, depending on how the second appeal comes out, you would still run into the issue of applying specific standards that would address the concerns that have been raised.
Right, but there at least we would have something to apply against those standards, because right now we're just making a determination on, is this definition the correct definition out of the definitions that we have. Commissioner Westerberg.
Yeah, out of the definitions we have seems to be that's the real dilemma. I would say that just from a zoning standpoint, it does not appear that this is really a rooming house. The extent of the social services that are available, that need to be available, and while Connections for the Homeless may pay rent to the landlord, the residents themselves do not pay rent, which seems to sort of knock out the intent of that definition of rooming house. So I don't see how it meets the standards as a rooming house. I would like to think we can come up either with something, or as we go through the process, find a way to modify the language to accept the fact that this is an intriguing model, but it needs to be treated as a model for something within the context of real estate and zoning. And right now, that rooming house definition just does not seem to fit. And that's just my opinion on that.
I want to draw our attention to page 20 of the packet, because I think we're getting a little unfocused already. We're not trying to decide the suitability of a rooming house, and we're not trying to come up with a new definition tonight. Everybody, I think, here probably agrees that the definitions available are not, none of them are perfect. What we're trying to do is determine if the determination of use made by the zoning administrator was arbitrary, ill-considered, or erroneous. That's what we're trying to decide. And given the options available to the administrator at the time, I think she picked the right one, or the closest one that's feasible.
So, Chair Rogers, is that correct? Are we judging the decision by the zoning administrator as opposed to simply saying we do not agree with the definition of rooming house for the
Right,
property?
that is correct. We're not here to debate the argument as to whether or not the rooming house definition is a legitimate definition. Like I said, we're going to hear several different cases on this particular one. And so the appeal that's before us today is, given the definitions that we have, because we cannot create a new definition, is the operation of this facility closest to a rooming house, a transitional shelter, or I've heard assisted living and transitional, I don't remember the fourth one, transitional treatment facility. That seems to be the four that everyone's focused on. You know, I'll just throw in kind of where I am on this. In looking at the definitions, there's a couple things that do sort of concern me about how this operates. But again, with the definitions we have, the words I'm looking at in particular, and where I went with my my questioning of the woman who works, and I can't remember her name, and I've handed the sheet off, about, you know, I'm a homeless person and I'm coming in trying to fit in. And so when I look at a transitional shelter, one of the words I see there is emergency. And if I'm being asked to wait for a couple days, a couple weeks, whatever, to me, that doesn't address an emergency. In looking at a rooming house, you know, one of the discussions that come up is compensation, but it does say that it's with compensation, whether direct or indirect. And so if Connections for the Homeless is paying the Margarita Inn to house people, that is an indirect payment. It's not coming directly from the person who is homeless, but there is a payment going for their operation. I tend to think that this does lean closest into a rooming house, given the definitions that we have. But that's my personal interpretation of these. Commissioner Huco?
Just if one were to go with one or the other definition, what is then the practical outcome in terms of Connections operations, subject to regulation? You know, is all this pending the two upcoming appeals? What practical effects would this decision have? Because the neighbors are raising obviously issues that need to be addressed one way or another. I think the definitions are, you know, we're, as Commissioner Linwell pointed out, we're in a middle ground here. I don't think it meets either definition actually in terms of what's actually happening. But perhaps it's something to staff. What is the practical consequence of our deciding one way or another this evening?
So I'll just put my thoughts in, and then staff can respond how they feel. I mean, I think we're a little premature here, because this case in and of itself will not end anything. It will not address the issues about whether there are drugs, police calls, those sorts of things. No matter what definition we apply, doesn't matter in regard to those. So I think we need to look at the definition separately from those issues, and I'm not belittling any of those issues. I mean, I do recognize those as legitimate issues from the neighbors. But based on this application, or based on this appeal, we are looking at two definitions, or basically one definition, rooming house, and whether it is a rooming house or another type of definition. And it doesn't necessarily squarely fit easily into either one, but we have to put it into one or the other. The record is closed at this point. I understand what I do under. I'll ask you to please. I'm aware of the operation. I'm aware of what we have the ability to do. The folks on my commission know what they have the ability to do. So I will ask you please to stop interrupting me, and I will return to the conversation with the commissioners.
If I could just follow up. So if one were to call this transitional shelter, again, how would that practically impact the operations of Connections?
So
we can't get rid of the police issue. I agree with
Correct.
that. How does that then, as a practical matter, change how Connections operates? How whatever?
So where I would like us
Other regulated,
right. So where I would like us to go with this, again, I'm a little distraught that we've come this far into the conversation, and Connections for the Homeless has not applied for anything. They seem to be just kind of biding time, because typically when someone is found to be in violation of something, which we've had the determination made that the existing special use is not valid. Now we're hearing an appeal on that, but the appeal process stops the clock, as does the application process. Once we make a decision on that appeal in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is, then all the decisions are made. And if we determine the special use is not valid, then Connections for the Homeless is not operating validly any longer. And so they have to remedy that. And one of the things that I would like us to address with Connections for the Homeless this evening is I would very much like to see a special use application submitted. They've been operating in this manner for 2 years, and so they don't have to draw plans. There's nothing like this. This is all about their operations. And I would like that to be submitted so that we actually have an application in hand, so that when we make a decision in 2 or 3 weeks, whether or not the special use is valid, we know exactly where we're going with the third meeting, which will be a hearing on a special use. During that hearing, the applicant would have to apply for a special use for either a rooming house or a transitional shelter based on what we decide this evening. And then the conditions would be placed on that application when we hear that and make our recommendation to City Council. And again, that's just how I would like to see this play out. Commissioner Lindwall?
Yes, I think that the question is really a simple one, and the appeal is this, a rooming house, or is it not something else? We don't have to say what the something else is, and there are ways, so I think that that's where the focus is, and I think that given the description of the operation, I don't think it's a rooming house. It's not. It's not the same as the YMCA. It's actually not the same as a number of the, the student, rooming houses that are, in other neighborhoods in Evanston that provide, rooming house services. They don't provide meals necessarily. So that's kind of my thought process, and
Right.
I think that that's, so I think that the question is whether or not we agree that the zoning administrators determined, she found the best fit, but the question is whether or not that's the correct fit.
Right, and when we review that, I would like us to review it to the definition and not to other facilities.
Right.
So,
I agree.
So we can't necessarily say, well, the Y does this and they do this, so that.
No, but I'm just saying that given the description
Right.
that Connections for the Homeless gave to the operation of this facility, I don't believe it meets the definition of rooming house well enough to support the zoning administrator.
I will just say I agree with that.
But then are you saying that the decision made by the zoning administrator was arbitrary, ill-considered, or erroneous?
I think erroneous, because I think probably, the logic, I mean, there's logic there, but, do I think it was the correct decision? No, which,
Not
kind of
correct.
goes.
Arbitrary, ill-considered, or erroneous? You think it was an erroneous decision?
Erroneous means incorrect, so yes.
Yes.
I'm going to turn.
I'd like to know where that other language came from. That seems a rather strong language to use for.
Page 20 of the packet.
Okay, I missed that, sorry.
I'm going to ask for input from this side. You've been very quiet. So I'd just like to get the thoughts from the commissioners on this side.
I mean, taking into consideration all the neighbors and everybody, but I do agree with Administrator Klotz and her decision on rooming house, because a transitional shelter is basically you don't really live anywhere. I'm sorry if you disagree with what I'm saying. You have to carry all of your stuff every single day, come back to the facility at the end of the day, and hope you're able to get in. That is what a transitional shelter is. It's very different, and unfortunately, these are the definitions that we have. But if you want a real definition of what a transitional shelter is, you do not live there permanently. You take your stuff every single day, and you have to be out of that facility for 12 hours, and you come back hoping you can get back in.
Commissioner Meritchuk, do you have thoughts?
So I'll go back to what some of the colleagues discussed. First, the decision of the administrator, I think that in her power was to make a decision based on current ordinance, and she had only the definitions in front of her. So making the closest one is the one I think her decision was right. On the more important part, what actually this is, I would say we don't have a definition that is close to what the actual business model, I would call it this way, of Connections for Homeless is. And this is important that probably we'll have to have this one. For the current status of things, I think that the decision of the zoning administrator is right, and this will be a rooming house, per definition.
All right, thank you. We do have, should I go through your 4 standards that you had to adhere to?
I would recommend that you address the standards when you're making a determination.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything anybody else would like to add at this particular moment before we go through standards? Commissioner Hugo?
And again, maybe I'm beating a dead horse. If one one does not feel this meets the definition of a boarding house, even though that's the best definition, perhaps, given the paucity of good definitions, does that mean that you're then saying it is a transitional shelter, or you're just saying it's something else?
It's something else that is already defined in our ordinance. It can't be something that is not defined in our ordinance, because
Okay.
it has to be applied in somewhere. So if it's not a rooming house, it has to be something.
And will we make that if we decide it is not a rooming house, do we then say what it is? Or
We don't have to say what it is.
Okay. And the consequence of that is we say it's not a rooming house, but we don't say what it is. What then happens?
That then Connections for the Homeless would have to make a choice as to, if they came to us with a special use application, what would they pick, again, out of our available definitions?
Unless they decided to define a new, whatever the facility is, they can do a text amendment proposing a new definition.
We can, and
No,
this matter will be before us in 6 months.
It'll come back.
Right.
It's not us that has to do the text amendment. The applicant can propose a text amendment.
Correct.
Chair Rogers, I would recommend that the commission either makes a determination on what other use it should be, or determines that a text amendment should be applied for. I don't think it's appropriate to leave it up to Connections, because in theory then that could continue to be appealed on whatever use they choose over and over. So I think the best approach is that if the zoning administrator's determination is not correct, that a specific determination is made, or request for text amendment.
Okay. In looking at the determination of use findings that the zoning administrator uses, there are 4 standards that she reviews, 5 standards that she reviews. The first one being that any use must be defined in Chapter 18 of this title. So we do find that in her determination, a rooming house is a defined definition, which is a building or portion thereof containing lodging rooms that accommodate more than 3 persons who are not members of the keeper's family, and where lodging excluding food service is provided for compensation, whether direct or indirect. I believe that this standard has been met and that the zoning administrator was correct in her decision, but I will listen to anyone else who would like to weigh in differently. Again, this is not making the determination that this is a rooming house. It's just saying she selected something that is a definition in the ordinance. Second one is no use interpretation shall permit any use in a district unless evidence shall be presented that demonstrates that it will comply with the general district regulations established for that particular district. We do find that a rooming house is defined as a special use within the R6 district, which is what this is. And that's the way that she has chosen to define it, but it does fit within this particular district. So I believe that standard also has been met. No use interpretation shall permit any use in a particular district unless such use is substantially similar to other uses permitted in such a district and is more similar to such other uses than to uses permitted or specially permitted in a more restrictive district. So in looking at this, we find that that in sort of looking at where this sort of fits based within this particular district and the types of uses that are permitted there. Obviously, in an R6 district, we find multiple family dwellings, shelters for abused persons, residential care home type 1 and type 2, and a hotel, and a transitional shelter. So this is kind of where that question comes in as to, is the rooming house the best definition? Obviously, this is not a multifamily dwelling because it's not does not have the kitchens and is not individual units, as one would think of a particular separate living unit. They are dependent on other services outside of their unit. It's not a shelter for abused persons because we are not talking about abuse. This is not a shelter for abuse for domestic violence. It is not a residential care home type 1 or type 2 because this is not necessarily a place where people occupy it as behaving in a similar style to a family, which is what those facilities would do. A hotel, obviously, this is not a hotel because that is typically transient guests who come and go very quickly. And then the final definition being the transitional shelter. And this is where we're going to have the disagreement, I feel, because I think that because I do not determine this to be an emergency basis, I do not believe that this is a transitional shelter. But I know that some other people will have different thoughts, and I'd ask them if they'd just like to briefly.
Yeah, this is one where I don't think the standard is met because I don't think I think this is a unique use or a different kind of use. I don't want to use unique use because that's got a special definition in our zoning code, but it's different than the other similar uses, and that's, the C is where I have the problem, and for that reason, I don't believe that standard is met, and that's why I would not support the zoning administrator's determination.
All right. The fourth standard is if the proposed use is most similar to a use permitted only as a special use in the district in which it is proposed to be located, then any use interpretation permitting such use shall be conditioned on the issuance of a special use permit for such use pursuant to section 635. This is something that we'll be discussing at the next hearing, because right now, as the zoning administrator stands, her decision stands at this particular time, she has found that it is no longer a valid special use. But that it is a rooming house which is permitted in this district under a special use license. Therefore, that would require a special use to be issued for a rooming house to continue to operate at this location. Again, we will get to that matter at a different case because, again, this hearing is not going to make a final determination on this property. So I believe that this standard is met at this particular moment. In part through the fact that it is a rooming house that is permitted, but that the valid special use is no longer, or the special use is no longer valid pending the appeal that comes before us next time. And finally, no use interpretation shall permit the establishment of any use that would be inconsistent with the statement of purpose of the district in question. The R6 district is our densest district in residential before we get into the downtown core. So this is something that we would expect to see happening there. And again, it being a rooming house makes it an eligible special use. So I believe that standard has been met as well. So the question now before us is there a motion to uphold or appeal, either in whole or in part, the decision of the zoning administrator? Yeah. Anyone want to make said motion? Preferably in the affirmative if we have it, just because we typically like to do an affirmative as opposed to a negative motion. So.
I would make a motion that the commission would repeal the definition of this property as a rooming house.
I'm sorry.
I think
That's a negative?
Yeah, so if there's a positive to support the zoning administrator's decision, so if that exists. If it doesn't exist, then we have to do it, but from conversation I've heard.
I'll make the motion to uphold the zoning administrator's decision, although I will be voting no, but I will make
Thank you.
the motion to uphold the zoning administrator's decision that this is a rooming house.
So it has been moved by Commissioner Lindwall. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Westerberg. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I'm going to ask for a roll call vote on this, even though we no longer have to do roll call votes, I don't think, but.
Commissioner Aravallo?
Yay.
Commissioner Westerberg?
No.
Commissioner Rodinchev?
Yay.
Commissioner Linwall?
No?
Commissioner Hugo?
No.
Commissioner Pictel?
Yes.
And Chair Rogers?
Yes. So I have a vote of 4-3. Based on our rules, this is not a final determination. We must have a majority concurrent vote of members of the board, whether the positions are seated or not. We currently are a board of 10 people. Which means we need 6 concurring votes, either in favor of something or in favor of supporting something or in favor of denying something. So this matter will be continued for the final vote, but at the next meeting, I will question the commissioners who were not present this evening. There will be no additional testimony. They will simply be asked if they have reviewed the record and to cast a vote in this particular matter. So that will take care of that particular matter. One thing that's come up that I mentioned that I would like to see is, I don't know how the rest of the commission feels on this. I would very much like to see Connections for the Homeless submit a special use application sometime within the next 10 days so that we can get this case on the docket. And depending on what happens at the next appeal, we don't lose momentum and have periods of time where things are not happening.
William McKenna, again, the attorney for Connections. We will do that.
Thank you. I'd appreciate it very much. And that way we will have something before us to discuss during that special use application process. Should the appeal at the next meeting fail, that will be an opportunity then for people to request conditions on the particular property and how we would move forward in Connections continuing to operate in this procedure should that advance through us, through P&D, and through City Council. We are only a recommending body on that particular matter on a special use, but I would like to get that process started so we aren't in this, as Mr. Dillow said, we're kind of in this gray area of limbo. So I would very much appreciate that and ask that that happen. That's the only case we had this evening. Is there any communication from staff to bring forth before the board?
Just to note that for the next meeting, we do have another appeal case, and we do need 6 concurrent votes for both of the appeals, so please, everyone, try to be present. Thank you.
We now have a section for public comment. This is just a brief comment, not about anything in particular, but if there's something that anybody would like to bring forward before this board. And not seeing anybody raising any hands, I'm going to... Thank you. And do know that we do try to be as fair and make our considerations based on the facts before us. And with that, I will ask if there is a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Moved by Lindwall, second.
Second.
Second by Puchtel. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? With that, we stand adjourned until our next meeting, which will be on
May 25th.
May 25th in council chambers. Thank you.